Welcome to Warfront Global. This channel studies the hidden forces behind global conflicts, the economic shocks, the strategic moves, and the decisions that reshape the world economy. If you are someone who likes to understand what is really happening behind the headlines, then please consider subscribing. Think of it like sharing important news with an old friend, someone experienced, someone who has seen many changes in the world. So take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and join us here on Warfront Global. And one more thing, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. It is always fascinating to see how many different parts of the world are connected by the same story. Now, let us return to the question that started all of this. The story began on March the 2nd, the third day of a rapidly expanding regional conflict. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps released a formal military statement that immediately captured international attention. According to the statement, Iranian ballistic missiles had targeted 2 locations inside Israel. The first location was described as the official office of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The second was the residence of Israel's Air Force Commander Tomer Bar. The announcement was direct and carefully written. It described the attack as a precision operation, but one sentence inside that statement changed the entire narrative. Iran declared that Netanyahu's fate was unclear. Within minutes, the message spread through international news networks, financial terminals, and social media platforms. When a sitting prime minister is mentioned in the context of a missile strike, markets do not wait for full confirmation. They react immediately. Israel's government responded the same day. Officials dismissed the Iranian statement as false information, and the prime minister's office issued a written denial. In normal circumstances, that response might have closed the story quickly, but these were not normal circumstances. Israel had already entered strict wartime media restrictions several days earlier. International journalists were not allowed to freely access strike zones. Reporting about damage to military infrastructure required official clearance. These restrictions were designed to protect national security, but they also created something else, an information vacuum. And in geopolitics, a vacuum rarely stays empty. For several days after the missile claim, Netanyahu did not appear in any live press conference. There was no televised address and no extended public appearance that could be independently verified. For international observers, the timing became noticeable. Global news organizations began asking questions. Financial analysts monitoring the conflict noticed the same pattern. The uncertainty was not about whether Israel still had leadership. The uncertainty was about visibility. Leadership during wartime is often demonstrated through public presence, press briefings, televised addresses, visits to military sites. These appearances signal stability, and stability matters not only to citizens, it matters to allies, to investors, and to financial markets. Because when the leadership of a country involved in a major regional war becomes temporarily invisible, analysts begin examining every possible explanation. While the world was still focused on one question, where is Netanyahu? Another development quietly appeared in the background. It did not involve missiles. It did not involve explosions. But for diplomats and analysts, it was far more revealing. 2 senior American officials who were scheduled to travel to Israel suddenly canceled their visit. The planned trip was not symbolic. It was strategic. One of the officials was Steve Witkoff, a senior representative trusted by Washington to manage sensitive negotiations across the Middle East. Over the previous months, he had been involved in several quiet diplomatic channels, discussions related to ceasefire arrangements, hostage exchanges, and indirect communication with Iranian intermediaries. The second official was Jared Kushner, a figure closely associated with previous diplomatic initiatives in the region. He had helped design earlier normalization agreements between Israel and several Arab states. Both men were scheduled to meet Prime Minister Netanyahu during the middle of the conflict. And then, the trip was canceled. There was no dramatic press conference, no long explanation. Just a short announcement, the visit would not take place. For most people watching the news, this looked like a minor scheduling change. Governments cancel trips all the time during wars, but inside diplomatic circles, cancellations like this carry meaning. Because high-level visits during wartime are usually intended to achieve one specific goal: coordination. When 2 allies launch military operations together, they must constantly adjust their strategy. Political leaders need to confirm objectives, review intelligence, and determine how far escalation should go. Face-to-face meetings are the fastest way to do that. When those meetings disappear, analysts begin asking why. Reports soon began appearing in regional newspapers suggesting that the United States had been surprised by the scale of some Israeli operations. In particular, several strikes had targeted Iranian oil infrastructure. Energy facilities are not ordinary military targets. They are strategic economic assets. When oil infrastructure is attacked, the consequences move far beyond the battlefield. Within days of the strikes, global oil prices moved sharply upward. Traders watching the conflict started calculating how disruptions in the Middle East might affect global supply. For Washington, this created a serious problem. Higher oil prices do not only affect energy companies, they affect transportation, manufacturing, food costs, and inflation across the entire global economy. In the United States, rising energy prices quickly become a political issue. Every additional dollar at the fuel pump is felt by voters. For Israel's leadership, however, the strategic calculation was different. Israel's military planners were focused on degrading Iran's long-term capabilities, particularly missile production and the financial networks that support those programs. From that perspective, targeting economic infrastructure could weaken Iran's ability to sustain military operations. Two allies, but two different strategic priorities. Washington wanted a limited operation with clear boundaries. Israel appeared prepared to expand the list of targets if it believed doing so would reduce future threats. This difference did not automatically mean a break in the alliance, but it did introduce tension. And in geopolitics, tension between allies can be as important as pressure from enemies. Iran's leadership understood this dynamic very well. If the United States and Israel remained perfectly aligned, their combined military and economic power would be extremely difficult to counter. But if disagreements began appearing between them, even small ones, those differences could gradually widen. That is why the cancellation of a single diplomatic trip began to attract attention from analysts around the world. Because wars are rarely decided only by missiles. They are also shaped by trust between the partners fighting them. And if trust begins to weaken, even slightly, the balance of the conflict can start shifting in ways that are not immediately visible. By the second week of the conflict, analysts began to notice something unusual about Iran's approach. Tehran was not simply responding with military strikes, it was shaping the narrative of the war itself. Modern conflicts operate across multiple layers. There's the visible battlefield where missiles, drones, and aircraft operate. But behind that layer sits another battlefield, one defined by perception, messaging, and strategic timing. Iran appeared to be fighting on both fronts simultaneously. The announcement about Netanyahu's office was one example. Whether or not the strike caused physical damage was almost secondary. The real effect came from the uncertainty it created. When a government denies an attack, but cannot immediately provide clear visual confirmation, questions naturally begin to circulate. Iran did not need proof to trigger speculation. The statement alone was enough to push the story into global headlines. From Tehran's perspective, this approach created pressure in several directions at once. First, it placed psychological pressure on Israel's leadership by forcing them to respond to a narrative they did not fully control. Second, it introduced doubt among international observers about the stability of Israel's wartime command structure. And third, it encouraged analysts to examine whether the alliance supporting Israel was operating smoothly. But the information campaign was only one part of the strategy. Iran also began applying pressure through military actions directed at regional infrastructure and foreign bases connected to the conflict. Several American installations across the Gulf region reported repeated drone and missile threats. These attacks were not always designed to cause large-scale damage. Often they served a different purpose, reminding regional governments that hosting foreign military forces could bring retaliation onto their territory. For countries like Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Kuwait, this created a complex calculation. These governments maintained close security relationships with the United States, including hosting military facilities that support American operations. At the same time, their economies depend heavily on stable energy exports and secure shipping routes. Every missile interception over the Gulf reminded them of a difficult reality. The longer the war continued, the higher the economic cost for the region. At the global level, other powers were watching carefully. Russia stood to gain from any prolonged disruption in Middle Eastern energy markets. Higher oil prices strengthen Moscow's export revenues and increase Europe's dependence on alternative suppliers. China's position was different but equally strategic. As one of the largest importers of Middle Eastern energy, Beijing had strong incentives to prevent major supply disruptions, while quietly expanding its influence through trade and diplomatic engagement. The conflict, therefore, began evolving into something larger than a regional war. It was becoming a test of alliances, economic resilience, and geopolitical positioning. For investors, entrepreneurs, and business leaders observing these developments, the lesson was clear. Wars rarely affect only the countries directly involved. They ripple outward through commodity markets, shipping networks, and financial systems. And when those ripples begin interacting with existing political tensions between allies, the result can be a chain reaction that reshapes entire industries. The missile strikes had created the initial shock, but the deeper transformation was happening beneath the surface. Because while the world focused on explosions and headlines, the real struggle was unfolding in the relationships between the governments trying to control the outcome of the war. By the end of the second week, the central issue of the conflict was no longer simply about missiles, military strikes, or even the location of a single political leader. The deeper issue had become structural. A war that had begun as a coordinated operation between two powerful allies was slowly revealing fractures inside the very alliance directing it. For decades, the security structure of the Middle East has relied heavily on one central arrangement. The United States provides military protection, and in return, several Gulf states host American forces and infrastructure that allow Washington to project power across the region. Air bases, naval ports, intelligence facilities, and missile defense systems form the backbone of this architecture. But wars have a way of testing even the most stable systems. As the conflict expanded, several Gulf governments found themselves under increasing pressure. Iranian missiles and drones were not only targeting military installations, they were also threatening energy infrastructure and shipping routes that support the region's economic lifelines. Oil production facilities were forced to reduce operations in some areas. Liquefied natural gas exports faced interruptions. Shipping companies began adjusting their insurance costs for vessels traveling through nearby waters. Each of these disruptions carried financial consequences. For countries whose economies depend heavily on stable energy exports, even temporary interruptions can translate into billions of dollars in losses. This created a difficult political question for regional leaders. If hosting foreign military forces increases the likelihood of becoming a target, how long can that arrangement remain politically acceptable? So far, the Gulf states have continued allowing American defensive operations from their territory. Missile interceptions over their skies have protected civilian populations and energy infrastructure. But the longer the war continues, the more expensive this balance becomes. Economic pressure does not appear suddenly. It builds gradually through rising insurance costs, disrupted shipping schedules, energy market volatility, and investor uncertainty. For the global economy, the implications extend far beyond the region itself. Nearly a fifth of the world's oil supply passes through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important maritime choke points in global trade. Any sustained instability in that corridor immediately influences fuel prices, transportation costs, and manufacturing supply chains around the world. Businesses thousands of miles away, from logistics companies to airlines, begin adjusting their forecasts. Entrepreneurs watching the situation understand that geopolitical risk can travel faster than physical conflict. A missile fired in one region can alter investment decisions in another. Meanwhile, other global powers observe the situation with strategic patience. Russia benefits from higher global energy prices and the increased demand for alternative supply routes. China carefully monitors the stability of shipping lanes while expanding its economic relationships across multiple regions. Neither power needs to directly participate in the conflict to benefit from its economic consequences. This is why analysts often describe modern geopolitical competition as a long game. Military actions may dominate headlines, but structural shifts in alliances and economic systems often determine the long-term outcome. The question about Netanyahu's whereabouts was therefore never the most important part of the story. It was simply the moment that drew global attention to a deeper issue. When uncertainty appears inside the leadership structure of a country involved in a major conflict, investors and governments begin looking beyond the immediate event. They start asking broader questions. Are the alliances directing the war still aligned? Do the strategic objectives remain the same? And most importantly, how long can the economic system supporting the conflict remain stable? Because in the end, wars are not decided only by military victories. They are also decided by which side can maintain political cohesion, economic resilience, and alliance stability the longest. And in this conflict, those three factors are now under pressure at the same time.